Hey there, sleepy soul. Before we drift off together into this slow, slightly silly, and very sleepy history story, I've got a little bedtime task for you. Go ahead and drop a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now in your country. Is it midnight in your city? 2 a.m.? Or are you sneaking in a nap at 4 in the afternoon? I'd love to know. Alright, now that we've taken care of that, it's time to get comfy. Let your eyes get heavy. Let the thoughts of the day melt away. You're about to hear a history story so slow, so gentle, and just boring enough in the best possible way that you might not even make it to the end before you're fast asleep. And that's okay. That's kind of the point. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's go back to Boston in the year 1919, where something very sweet and very sticky was about to change history. Ready? Let's begin. Tonight, you're about to embark on a journey so slow, so sticky, so strangely uneventful, that you just might fall asleep before anything happens. And that's okay. Because this is the story of the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. Yes, it happened. And no, it's not a dream, although it might feel like one after 15 minutes of me talking about barrels and syrup. The year is 1919. The place? Boston, Massachusetts. The air? Cold. The streets? Cobblestoned. The fashion? Loud and itchy. Everyone's walking around in wool, looking slightly uncomfortable but pretending not to be, because that's what people did back then. Now, at the edge of Boston's north end stood a giant, dark, mysterious structure. A tank. Not a war tank. No, this was much scarier. It was a molasses tank. Molasses, for those who've never been personally attacked by it in their breakfast cereal, is a thick, sticky syrup made from sugar cane. It moves like honey if honey had anxiety. This particular tank belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. And it was big. 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, and able to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. That's enough molasses to drown your will to live, and a few actual things too, but we'll get to that slowly. From the moment it was built, the tank had one job: hold the molasses. That's it. Unfortunately, it was bad at that. Residents claimed it groaned like a sleepy walrus on hot days. Sometimes it leaked. Kids would go over with cups and scoop molasses from the sides. And instead of fixing it properly, the company just painted it brown so no one could see the leaks. Meanwhile, molasses was being stored to make alcohol, specifically industrial alcohol, which was important back then because World War I had just ended, and apparently nothing says peace like 2 million gallons of sugar goo. Molasses is not known for being a fast mover. It's not a liquid that rushes into action. It's more like the liquid version of someone who hit snooze 8 times. Which made what happened next all the more shocking. But not yet. Not yet. We're still setting the mood here. Let's take a moment to imagine 1919 Boston. A horse-drawn carts clip-clopping down the street. A street vendors yelling in thick Boston accents, probably about clams. A people pretending not to notice the weird groaning noises coming from the molasses tank, like it was just a haunted syrup barrel. And through it all, this giant tank sat there. Full. Creaky. A little leaky. A little suspicious. Kind of like your uncle at Thanksgiving dinner. There were quite a few people who had no idea that their lives were about to become very sticky history. There was Antonio, the delivery man, who rode past the tank every day and sometimes thought, yeah, That doesn't sound safe. There was Mary, who ran a little bakery across the street. Her window faced the tank. Her muffins were dry. But at least they were safe, for now. And Old Man Griffin, who swore the tank was evil, but also thought sandwiches were a conspiracy, so no one listened to him. The community had questions, of course. Like, why does the tank make noises? And should molasses be bubbling like that? But as always, life moved on. Slowly. Like molasses. January 15, 1919, was weirdly warm. Around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius. For Boston in winter, that's like a beach day. People were outside, enjoying the unexpected heat. The molasses inside the tank, however, was not enjoying it. You see, warm weather makes molasses less thick, more runny, and far more dramatic. And the tank? Oh, the tank was not built to handle dramatic molasses. But that's where we'll pause. Because nothing has happened yet. And you might already be drifting off. And if you're still awake, don't worry. Nothing explodes yet. It began with a low, deep rumble. The kind of sound you might hear when your stomach remembers you skipped lunch, but louder. Much louder. At 12:40 p.m., the molasses tank finally gave up. After years of groaning, leaking, and being painted instead of repaired, it decided, that's enough, and split open like an overfilled donut. What happened next was slow. But also not slow. Because although molasses moves at a pace that makes snails look athletic, this was 2.3 million gallons of it, under pressure. The tank burst open with the force of a freight train made entirely of syrup. The wave that came rushing out was described as being 25 feet high. That's 2 stories tall. Of molasses. Just molasses. Now, molasses isn't water. It's thick, it's heavy, and it doesn't stop when you say, "Excuse me, please." It was moving at an estimated 35 miles per hour. That might not sound fast, but for a breakfast condiment, that's Olympic-level speed. The wave rolled through the streets like something out of a desert-themed horror film. It flattened buildings, knocked over rail cars, lifted a firehouse off its foundation, and even tossed a truck like it was a marshmallow in a hot chocolate. Horses didn't stand a chance. People tried to run, but have you ever tried to run through molasses? It's like trying to sprint through a swimming pool full of peanut butter. Only colder, and stickier, and filled with despair. Eyewitnesses described the scene as chaotic and surreal. One man said it felt like the ground had opened up and tried to eat the city. Another claimed he was just standing there, thinking about sandwiches, and then suddenly found himself knee-deep in sugar goo. There were shouts, splashes, and the eerie sound of suction as people tried to move but couldn't. Some found themselves stuck in the molasses like insects in amber. Firemen came to help, but quickly realized that you can't really fight molasses with a hose. Meanwhile, the tank itself crumpled like a tin can. Sheets of metal twisted around buildings, telephone poles snapped, and molasses crept into basements, shops, and stairwells. It was as if someone had poured a giant bottle of syrup over a model train set, if that train set was Boston, and the syrup had a grudge. Rescuers worked through the night. Dogs used to sniff for survivors got stuck in the goo themselves. Boats were used in the flooded streets. Boats! In molasses! The only thing missing was a pancake the size of a city block. The cleanup was just as awful. Because here's the thing, molasses doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It seeps into everything. It stained the streets, the buildings, and people's shoes for months. Some say on hot days, the north end of Boston still smells like old syrup. And that's not a joke. Back then, they didn't have power washers or fancy cleaning solutions. They used what they had: water, sand, and very tired people. Crews scrubbed and scraped. Horses tracked molasses all over the city. Shoes stuck to sidewalks. Even the harbor turned brown. And the press, as always, had a field day. Headlines read, "Molasses floods Boston." Some papers tried to be serious, others leaned into the absurdity. One headline reportedly said, "A sea of syrup smothers city," which sounds more like a dessert fantasy than a disaster. People wanted answers. How did this happen? Whose fault was it? Could it happen again? The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, of course, denied everything. It wasn't the tank, they said. It was anarchists. Or maybe the weather. Who can say? But the people of Boston weren't buying it. There were lawsuits, investigations, and very sticky lawyers. Eventually, after years of back and forth, the company was found responsible. Turns out, when you build a tank that big and don't test it properly, or listen to the screaming sound it makes every time the sun comes out, you might be at fault. Over 100 people were injured. At least 21 lost their lives. All because someone tried to cut corners on a giant vat of syrup. And yet, somehow, it became a kind of legend. A slow-moving, sweet-smelling catastrophe that people still talk about a century later. Not because it was glorious or brave or heroic, but because it was weird. Weird, slow, and sad. But also, kind of funny in a "how is this real" kind of way. And as the molasses slowly sank into the cobblestones, and the city of Boston picked itself up, sticky, confused, and a little bit sweeter, it quietly became part of history. The kind of history that makes you wonder how anything works at all. And that, dear listener, is where we'll pause again. Let your thoughts drift like syrup across an empty plate. Nothing's chasing you. No molasses waves tonight. Just dreams. Sweet, slow dreams. After the flood, Boston didn't just deal with a mess. It dealt with a legacy. The kind of legacy that sticks around, literally. People would tell stories for decades about where they were when the molasses hit. Some said they were swept off their feet. Others said they almost outran it, but slipped because their shoes got glued to the street. One man even claimed he rode the wave for a few feet like it was some kind of slow-moving caramel surfboard. No one believed him. But also, no one could prove he didn't. The newspapers moved on eventually, as they always do, but not the people. For weeks, months, even, you couldn't go anywhere in the North End without hearing someone mutter something like, "Still smells like pancakes in here," or "I found syrup in my sock drawer again." And cleanup? Oh, we haven't talked enough about that yet. Cleaning up molasses isn't like cleaning up a spilled drink. It's not a one swipe and you're done situation. It's more like, this is your life now. You and this broom are married. You'll never be clean again. The city brought in hundreds of workers. Firefighters were ordered to spray down the streets, but the molasses just laughed and got stickier. The molasses stuck to people's clothes, their tools, their wagons. Horses would trot by and leave little molasses hoofprints like it was some kind of sugary crime scene. The ocean didn't get off easy either. The Boston harbor turned brown. Imagine a seaside view that looked like someone spilled a chocolate milkshake into it and walked away. Fish were, understandably, not pleased. The salt water eventually diluted it, but only after weeks. Even ships refused to dock for a while. Sailors were like, "We're not bringing our boat into that syrupy soup. We have standards." There were stories of mothers throwing out entire batches of laundry because they were impossible to unstick. One woman claimed her dog was still slightly tacky even 2 months later, despite repeated baths. At some point, you just give up and decide your pet is now molasses flavored. And as the city cleaned, the lawsuits rolled in. This wasn't just an "oops, my bad" situation. This was full-on legal syrup warfare. The court case lasted for years. Over 100 lawsuits were filed. The company tried everything to avoid blame. They said anarchists blew up the tank. They said the tank was strong enough. They even suggested the tank failed due to unusual fermentation. Fermentation. As in, maybe the molasses got a little tipsy and exploded. Right. But investigators eventually found out the real reason was much simpler, and far more human: cost-cutting. The tank was poorly designed, improperly tested, and never inspected by anyone qualified. In fact, it was rushed into service without a single stress test. It was basically held together with wishful thinking and rust. After a long, sticky legal battle, the company had to pay over $600,000 in damages, a huge sum at the time. Adjusted for today, that's millions. Enough to buy a small island, or, say, a giant molasses tank that doesn't explode. And as the dust and syrup settled, Boston did what Boston always does. It moved on. Slowly. Cautiously. And with a new rule of thumb: don't ignore groaning tanks filled with thick sugar liquid. You'd think this would be the end of the story. But no. The molasses flood became a symbol. Not of triumph. Not of strength. But of the importance of engineering. Of taking leaks seriously. Of never trusting a tank that sounds like it's haunted by breakfast spirits. It was studied in engineering schools as a cautionary tale. Architects pointed to it and said, "See? Don't do that." Historians chuckled at the absurdity, but never forgot the tragedy underneath the stickiness. And the city? It eventually dried off. New buildings were put up. The streets were repaved. But every now and then, on an oddly warm winter day, someone would swear they could smell molasses again. Maybe it's imagination. Or maybe molasses has a longer memory than we think. Either way, the Great Molasses Flood became part of Boston's strange little storybook. A reminder that sometimes, the weirdest disasters are the ones that really happened. Slowly, sweetly, and with just enough chaos to keep history interesting. Close your eyes now. The molasses has passed. The streets are clean, mostly. And all is calm again. Now that the molasses had finally settled, quite literally, Boston could breathe again. Though some people still did so cautiously, just in case the air tasted sweet. Time moved on, and the city began adjusting to life post-syrup. But the legend of the flood never truly faded. It lived in stories whispered over coffee, in jokes told by grandfathers who swore they saw a cat surfing the wave, and even in local school children's retellings, which got more dramatic with every generation. By the 1930s, the story had already become folklore. Little kids would dare each other to lick the bricks near Commercial Street, claiming you could still taste molasses. Note, they usually couldn't, and those bricks were probably just dirty. But kids are fearless. Over the decades, people continued to debate details. Was the wave really 25 feet tall? Could molasses really move that fast? Did one man really get stuck for so long he missed 2 birthdays? Unlikely, but again, folklore. Meanwhile, engineers studied the event as if it were a strange kind of exam question. If a poorly constructed tank full of molasses bursts in downtown Boston at lunch hour, how many people will get glued to a bench? And to their credit, they took it seriously. The disaster actually led to better building codes and safety inspections. Suddenly, people began to realize that let's just fill it and hope for the best wasn't the most secure construction plan. One good thing about molasses, though, it doesn't sneak up on you. It's not like a ninja. It's more like an old man trying to chase a bus, determined, but slow, sticky, and making weird noises the whole way. Still, it did take a while before people stopped joking every time someone spilled maple syrup at breakfast. You better be careful, they'd say. That's how Boston almost ended. Restaurants near the North End started naming things after the flood. Molasses muffins, disaster donuts, sticky street scones. A local bakery even made a wave of sweetness cake, which was just a chocolate cake covered in so much molasses it had to be served with a spatula and regret. Tour guides began including the flood in their city tours. Over there's Paul Revere's house, and over here's where a wall of molasses tried to flatten half the neighborhood. And people listened. Because let's be honest, it's way easier to remember giant syrup wave than, say, zoning reform legislation. One quiet afternoon, many years after the event, a very old man named Sal sat on a bench near where the tank used to be. He wore suspenders, a dusty cap, and the kind of expression only someone who'd seen molasses fly could wear. Kids would ask, "Grandpa Sal, did you see the flood?" And he'd nod slowly and say, "Yes. I was there. It was slow. It was sweet. And it got in my shoes." "What was it like?" they'd ask. He'd pause, look off into the middle distance, and say something profound like, "You ever try washing syrup out of your socks? You can't. It becomes part of you." Whether or not Sal was actually there, who knows? But it doesn't matter, because the story had become bigger than any one person. It was a gentle kind of history, one that made people laugh, but also made them appreciate modern tanks, safety codes, and checking for leaks more often than never. Eventually, the spot where the tank stood was turned into a little park. Trees grew, benches were placed, and tourists took selfies, often standing where the wave once started, completely unaware they were posing on what used to be Boston's most unexpected desert disaster. A small plaque was installed. It didn't say much. Just a simple note about the date, the damage, and the syrup. No drama. No big headlines. Just quiet respect for the day molasses made the city stick together, mostly because it had no other choice. And on some warm days, the breeze would still carry the faintest hint of sugar. Or maybe that was just someone nearby eating pancakes. Either way, it felt peaceful. Sleepy. Safe. The molasses was gone. But the story? Oh, that would stick around forever. Years rolled on like sleepy trolleys through the streets of Boston. People lived, loved, grew old, and still sometimes found themselves pausing in that one part of the city, the one where the smell of molasses, real or imagined, never quite left. The Great Molasses Flood became a story people told not because it was grand or heroic, but because it was so human. A little ridiculous, a little sad, and entirely unforgettable. It didn't involve battles or kings or revolutions, it involved breakfast syrup and the unexpected force of gravity. And sometimes, that's all it takes to become a legend. Historians debated its importance, but locals never really cared about the technicalities. They just knew their neighborhood had once been overtaken by dessert. That was enough. Every now and then, some fresh-faced student would try to write a deep, meaningful thesis about it, something titled Viscous Catastrophe, the Semiotics of Syrup in Urban Infrastructure. But really, it all boiled down to, a giant tank burst, and everyone got very sticky. Simple. Sweet. One year, a local theater group even staged a musical called Molasses. It featured tap-dancing barrels, a villain named Rusty the Rivet, and a heartfelt solo by a guy dressed as a drop of molasses. It was surprisingly moving. The city, now decades past the flood, embraced the weirdness of it all. It didn't try to forget. Instead, it leaned in. Because once a river of sugar rolls through your streets, pretending to be normal just feels like a waste of time. And deep down, there was something comforting about it. Tragedy, yes, but also laughter. Something you could tell kids about without scaring them. Something that reminded everyone that even disasters could be sticky and slow and strangely charming. One chilly evening, as twilight fell over the city, a little boy tugged on his grandfather's sleeve. "Grandpa," he said, "tell me the story again." And the old man, tired but smiling, leaned back in his chair, stared up at the pink-tinged clouds, and began. Well, it started with a tank full of molasses. The boy giggled. He already knew every part of it. But he liked the way his grandfather told it, with pauses in just the right places, and that same old line near the end. "And that's why, my boy, we always check for leaks. Especially when sugar's involved." The boy nodded solemnly. It was probably about life, too. Or maybe socks. And somewhere, beneath the streets, in the very soil of the city, there might still be a hint of molasses. A trace. A whisper of a time when everything went slow. And quiet. And weird. So if you ever visit Boston and you walk through the North End, take a slow breath. Not because you'll smell molasses, though you might, but because you're walking through a story that stuck. One that never rushed. One that, like molasses, moved at its own sleepy pace. And as you rest your head tonight, remember, not every history tale needs kings or battles. Sometimes, it just needs sugar. Now close your eyes. The city is quiet again. The tank is long gone. And the only thing left to do is drift. Sleep well, traveler of time. You've survived the syrup.